to the Allen Press webinar, Securing the Future, Archiving Services in Scholarly Publishing. I'm Joanne Gillette, Product Marketing Manager at Allen Press, and I'll be your host today. Screen, you should see some general information about participating in the webinar. I'm going to go over a few of these items very quickly before we get started. Peter will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. If you do have questions, please use the chat function of web. Direct questions to the webinar host, that's me, during the presentation. We're using voice over IP technology to broadcast the audio for today's webinar, so please ensure you have the volume turned up on your PC if you're having trouble hearing. Continue the conversation with us and your fellow attendees after the webinar in the Questions tab of the Allen Press Facebook page. Here you can post a comment, share an idea, or ask a question. Peter Burns is going to provide an overview of digital archiving services. We'll explore some of the major digital initiatives available to scholarly publishers to give a basic foundation for evaluating the many options for digital content preservation. Peter Burns has worked in the publishing industry for more than 20 years. He spent several years as a copy editor at such publications as Popular Mechanics and the National Law Journal. In 2003, he joined Allen Press. He worked as a managing editor for several years and is now a publisher, managing 7 peer-reviewed journals. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Peter now. Don't forget to use the chat box on the lower right of your screen to send in your questions.
Well, thank you, Joanna, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this presentation on journal archiving. I'm glad you could be with us. I want to mention a couple of things just about the webinar. We are going to be discussing some of the major initiatives that are involved with journal archiving, and we will be providing links to those sources at the end of the webinar so you can find out more information from. And we will be archiving the webinar itself at allenpress.com in keeping with the theme of the presentation. So I want to start by just some of the highlights that I cover, and then we'll get more in depth. But I want to address today the reasons that we would want to archive scholarly content, the various challenges that make archiving very difficult, the prominent initiatives that are now at the forefront of archiving, can measure those initiatives are doing a job of archiving the content, and there are ways to measure the ability of those. And I also want to discuss whether or not there are still reasons to keep the print versions of publications in the long-term archive discussion. And we will get to that near the end, but there are some reasons that we might not want to totally abandon print just yet. And of course, we will have time at the end for questions and answers. So let's start with the main reasons that want to archive scholarly material. Main things that we would want to take into account. Look at natural disasters. Obviously, this has an effect on the physical storage. Whether the information is stored in print or digitally, there's a physical component somewhere. I mean, we only have to look at what happened earlier this year in Japan to see that there is potential here for loss of data if we have a fire or a flood, tsunami. Also consider the management and ownership of the titles, and they could be subject to business failure. If a publisher goes bankrupt and you've been accessing that publisher's titles and no longer, then even for past content, how would you find it? Simply see publication, either because they just don't make any money anymore, or science changes, and they become irrelevant. So, but if somebody wants to find that research, they want to make sure it's available. And this poor guy is experiencing something that we've probably all experienced before. Something happens online, and you just can't find something you have been able to find many times. So is backup. If one website goes down, can you find what you want from another website? So there are different components of archiving, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but one of these is to simply serve as a backup in case the primary website goes down. So the challenges that make art difficult. One, let's look at the technology. And technology can pose a challenge for several different reasons. The content that is now online originally started out as print content. So this was scanned and digitized. Well, scanning technology has improved greatly over the years, and it continues to improve. So if content originated as print, what the components of this, of course, is the scanning and what software is being used to convert those digital files into a format that is able to be stored and disseminated. So the file formats, the scanning technology itself, and also the end user devices. These formats that people accessing the content are going to be using. And there was a time when if you had a PC or a Mac on your desktop, you were game, you had everything you needed. Well, now, of course, there are smartphones, there are e-readers, there are tablets, and knows what's on the horizon. So the question we have to ask is, all of this content that's being digitized, will it be accessible when the mode of delivery continues to evolve? Another thing we want to consider is redundancy, and that's the need to have the information stored in various places. And there are different approaches to that, which we'll get to in a little bit. The sheer quantity of the material out there poses an enormous challenge. If you look at just the journals that are in Thompson's Journal Citation Report, these are just the publications that have impact. More than 10,000 journals. Okay, I don't even know how many journals are out there total, but it's got to be a much bigger number than that. 10,000 journals in the JCR come from about 2,000 publishers and about 80 countries. There's just an enormous volume of content out there. So trying to archive that, store it, make sure that it's accessible indefinitely poses a huge challenge. And who's going to pay for all of this scanning, hosting, and continued accessibility? The cost and the funding of such an enormous project poses a challenge. And then there's who is going to do this and who is going to manage it. The sheer organization of make sure that the information is collected, make sure that it's indexed properly so that people can find it, keeping up the technology, coordinating the funding, and the relationships that go into maintaining an archive. And then there's a shift in responsibility that is taking place currently. There was a time when the library was the archive, and so held the sole responsibility for maintaining that. Well, now publishers can maintain their own archives on their own websites, as well as to the libraries for storage there. So the shift in responsibility places the responsibility between the library and the publisher. And then there are other trends in this industry, such as business consolidation. One publisher purchases another publisher, or a small independently published journal signs on with a larger publisher. Anything like this represents a transfer in back content that has to be accounted for. If it's already archived in one place, will it be archived in a new place? Will we move the content or simply link to it? Another one involves copyright and ownership issues. There are journals that have not been administrating their copyrights. And so when those journals move to another service, maybe they sign on with a publisher, what happens to all that back content? If it's not copyrighted, then what is the administrative process for making it possible to even archive that? And then finally, another challenge is the conflict or potential for conflict among the many different stakeholders. And when we think about all of the various people who are stakeholders in archiving the scholarly record, we've got publishers, the societies that own the journals, the libraries that maintain the collections, not to mention the authors, editors, and readers who actually use the journals, the taxpayers and the governments who provide the funding for the research, and finally the future generations, the researchers who will be using this content long after we're gone and for whom we are preserving these archives. So with all of those challenges, this really sounds daunting, but who out there is going to take on these challenges and try to secure the scholarly record so that it outlives us? Well, there are a number of initiatives out there working on this, and I want to talk about each of these a little bit in depth. But first I want to address a concept that we will need to understand before going forward, and that is the concept of a light archive versus dark archive. The content in a light archive becomes available to authorized users when the original source becomes temporarily unavailable. And in this sense, an authorized user refers to a library that has or used to have subscription to the preserved content. On the other hand, content in a dark archive only becomes available to authorized users when a trigger event has occurred, and it makes sources such as the original journal or publisher website completely inaccessible. It's typically a catastrophic event. An example of this might be the discontinuation of a publication or a business failure of a publisher, a complete technical failure, or a natural disaster. And I think this is probably an imperfect analogy, but you might think of the light archive as a copy of a document in a file cabinet that you can run to if the main document is. The dark archive might be more like your safe deposit box. This is where you go if your house burns down, and you just have to get the original copy of the document. It's stored in this place, it's secure, and it's there when you need it. So with that in mind, let's start taking a look at some of the main initiatives that are currently archiving scholarly material. And the first I want to talk about is LOCS, and an acronym stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. Now, LOCS is a light archive, so it is accessible when necessary. It started in the early 2000s and is based at Stanford University. LOCS operates as a centralized peer-to-peer network. It serves as a backup for publishers' websites. The content is served locally to library members. The libraries themselves pay to participate in LOCS. Publishers participate simply by grant permission for their content to be included. So the way LOCS works is that each participating library has what's called a LOCS box. And a computer at the library. The library access and preserve on this terminal only the content for which it is authorized to access. It is stored in its original data format. When the file is called up, it is converted to a current file format upon access. And for the library to participate, the pricing is based on the solution and ranging $1,000 to more than $10,000 per year. So the initiative I want to talk about is related. It's called CLOCKS. It's also an acronym. It stands for Control. Unlike LOCKS, CLOCKS is a dark archive. Material is stored in the event that a trigger occurs necessary to release the content. Now, CLOCKS content is stored at about a dozen different libraries. But when it's released, if a event occurs, then it's copied from one of those archives and hosted at one of two organizations, the Adana Data Center, the University of Edinburgh, or at Stanford University. Libraries that participate in CLOCKS maintain and improve CLOCKS over time. The publishers contribute by granting permission for their content to be used. Another major initiative is Portico. Also a dark archive, and it was created in 2002, funding from the Mellon Foundation, and it's part of Ithaca, which is an umbrella organization that consists of several other initiatives. We'll be talking more about that later. The content in Portico is released also by trigger events. And the libraries that participate in Portico pay to participate based on their total materials expenditures. The public also pay based on their ebook or e-journal revenues. Now, Portico preserves the publisher's metadata and also creates Portico-specific metadata, and this is to ensure the accessibility of the content. However, it is not considered a replacement for the publisher's website. And the reason for that is because Portico does not make an effort to replicate the website itself. It stores material that's on the website and ensures that it's accessible. If you consider how frequently technology changes, styles change, if you look at a website that's 10 years old at this point, it looks dated. Well, Portico's job is not to maintain the look and feel of a publisher's website, just accessibility of the content. And so for that reason, it's not considered a backup mechanism. The initiative that I want to talk about is eTrust, which is a shared digital repository. It's a little bit different from the others that I just mentioned. It was started by the University of Michigan Libraries in 2008, and it has two key missions: preservation and access. Most material in the hardcopy is open access. It pretty works with its library partners, and it has more than 50. But also open to working with publishers who want to archive their content. But publishers who would have the archive in hardcopy would need to understand that it's going to be open access and openly accessible. Another interesting thing that hardcopy is doing is work with the University of Michigan Library Copyright Office to identify orphaned works. These are works whose copyright holders can be identified or contacted. So it makes bibliographic information about these works available. And then if they are not able to contact the copyright holder or no one contacts them, it eventually is released to the public. So those I would consider to be the main long-term preservation initiatives. but there are some others that are doing some important things that we need to look at. The next I'll talk about is JSTOR. JSTOR was established in 1995 as a pilot program under direction of the University of Michigan and is now also part of Ithaca. It was established to convert print material to digital format. This began as archiving mostly older material, but JSTOR, all of these initiatives, is evolving, and current content can be made available through what it calls its current scholarship program. Material in JSTOR is available to subscribers, who are mainly institutions. Another that JSTOR provides is that if you are a society that operates a journal and you want the content to be paid by subscribers but open to society members, you can work with her to accomplish that. Initiative, Library of the Netherlands, and I will even try the Dutch pronunciation. We'll just call this the KB. The KB has what it calls the eDepot long-term repository. This is an idea that was conceived in 1995 and was up and running in 2002. It is a long-term repository. It is neither a light nor dark archive, but access is determined by individual agreement. In the agreements, the KB is aimed to strike a balance between justified commercial interests of publisher and its own intrinsic mission to serve users and make material available. Material in the archive at KB is generally not available to the public. It is restricted to on-site use. The content can be released to a broader audience by trigger events, however. The next I want to discuss is PubMed Central. This is an effort by the National Library of Medicine, and it consists of biomedical and life sciences material only. It is only accessible by anyone. All of the content in PubMed Central is open access. However, applications are embargoed for a period of time, and when the information is placed in PubMed Central, it is typically the accepted version of the manuscript. Of course, more work may be done on the manuscript between the time it's accepted and the time it's published. So it's possible that changes will be made even after the accepted version is posted on PubMed Central. Next, I want to talk about the Bibliotheek Heritage Library. Now, this is a consortium of 12 natural history and botanical libraries. The information on the Biodiversity Heritage Library is biodiversity literature. None of it is books, but there are some journals on there as well. And this information is open access, available to anyone. So if you have journal archives, or if you have a book collection of biodiversity literature, the Biodiversity Heritage Library could work with to scan and digitize that material, and it would be hosted on its website. But we just need to understand that it's open access. So the major initiatives I want to discuss is known as PEPRS, which stands for Piloting an eJournal Registry Service. Now, this is not an archive per se. It is a registry service for all periodicals. Everything in this collection is a periodical. All content has its own ISSN number. And what PEPRS does is store information about where the journals are preserved. This information is stored in PEPRS at the volume level, not by individual article. So this is not a place where you go out where some such author's paper has been published. It doesn't have that information. What is relationships with Library, Clocks and Locks, Portico, and KB's eDepot, so that it can tell you where the journal you're looking for is being stored. Into the existing relationships, PEPRS is formalizing the process to allow agencies to participate. So I hope that gives you an overview of the main organizations that are working now to archive journal content. But of course, one of the things we want to know is, how do we know that all of these agencies properly storing and make available all of this digital information? Well, the Center for Research Libraries is how to answer that question. The Center for Research Libraries has established 10 basic characteristics for a reliable digital preservation repository. So I want to run through what these 10 basic characteristics are, and then we'll talk more about the Center for Research Library certification process. So the 10 basic characteristics are: the repository commits to continuing maintenance of digital objects for outside communities. It demonstrates organizational fitness, including financial, staff structure, and processes to fulfill its commitment. It acquires and maintains the contractual and legal rights and fulfills all such responsibilities. An effective and efficient policy framework. It acquires and ingests digital objects based upon stated criteria that correspond to its commitments and its capabilities. Maintains and ensures the integrity, the authenticity, and the usability of digital objects that it holds over time. It creates and maintains the requisite metadata about actions taken on digital object during preservation. Fulfills the requisite dissemination requirement. It has a strategic program for preservation planning and action, and has the technical infrastructure adequate to continuing maintenance and security of its digital objects. There are a lot of things that a digital preservation repository has to do to be considered reliable. Now, research libraries, or CRL, will perform and certify repositories. Looking at all of those 10 basic characteristics, but it issues its certification based mainly on 3 major categories. It's the organizational infrastructure, which includes the purpose and the scope of the archive, funding system, and the financial sustainability, basically how the archive does business. Many of the archives and initiatives that I've been talking about funded by nations or grants, the goal ultimately is to be financially self-sustaining. The second category of the CRL Audit and Certification is data management, including how it acquires the content, its preservation strategies, including keeping up with the changes in technology, and ability to disseminate the content. And finally, it looks at the technology itself, the technical infrastructure, and the security. Is the information protected from hacking, for example? Is information protected from physical damage, such as fire and flood detection systems? To date, CRL has certified two initiatives, Hardcopy and Portico. This means that they have asked for an audit from CRL and received it and have been certified. I want to stress this does not mean that any of the other initiatives are not doing all of these things. And in fact, they may be doing all of them and doing them well. What it means is that they have not asked or have not received an audit and certification from CRL. So I would expect in the future that we see more CRL certified initiatives. At this point in time, Hardcopy and Portico are the only two. So I want to a discussion to include print. We've been talking about digital repositories up to this point, and I think for many good reasons the emphasis in our thinking is on the digital, but consider for a minute that there are several reasons to making at least some of the information on your shelves. And information came from a report that was issued by Ithaca S&R, and this part of the broader organization Ithaca, which also includes JSTOR. The S stands for Strategic Consulting, and stands for Research Service. According to S&R, there are a number of reasons that a publisher or a librarian would want on to the print copies. That's the first one. Rare or unique works. Obviously, a scan of a Gutenberg Bible is no replacement for a Gutenberg Bible. I think you are fortunate enough to have something like that in your collection. It certainly needs to be preserved. That's not to say that it can, so that the information be shared. The original itself is worth something as a physical object. Obviously, we want to keep these found. Also want to preserve the hard copy in cases where we need a backup copy for scanning, because like these cookies, one is not enough. We want more. So if you have something scanned, say 10 or 15 years ago, and then you got rid of the print, and possible that you could get a much better scan if you still have at least one copy on file somewhere on a shelf. You could rescan it and improve the access online. The thing to keep in mind also is the potential of loss of digital records. The potential for loss is always there, whether you have a digital record or a paper record. So if a server crashes and you lose data, or if a format becomes unusable, you may want to have the print archive available that you can go back to. Also, the reliability of access. Another reason that you might want to keep the print is no matter how good the scan technology is, books contain very high quality images, and an excellent quality scan just might not do the original. So art collections, in particular, photography books, anything with very high quality images, there's a good reason to keep those around. And finally, has to keep in mind the needs of the local faculty. Now, this is a guy who obviously likes his print. And who among us is going to go to this fellow and say, we're taking the print collection away from your university library and move it to a remote location? Here an anecdote recently from the Chronicle of Higher Education. That's exactly what happened at Syracuse University. And we can probably learn a lesson. Hopefully, Syracuse University were informed by the administration that the plan to move the mail on the library shelves to a remote location 250 miles away. The humanities faculty considered the library on campus to be their central laboratory, and so they were up in arms about this. Repeated email exchanges, a letter of protest signed by more than 100 faculty, and finally a debate during a passionate university senate meeting. The meeting ended with both sides agreeing to consider alternatives. The library, for example, said that it was willing to consider moving its science-based content online and make room for humanities books on the shelves. Learn and take into account what local faculty needs are before making plans for their print collections. So, to look at what we've talked about, the various initiatives that are currently archiving content, ways we can determine if those initiatives are doing a reliable job of making the content permanently accessible, and reasons for keeping print around. Where does this information leave us? And if you have a journal, you're trying to figure out how to achieve long-term permanent archiving. There are a couple of things that you should probably do. One is to take a look at where your journal content is going now. If it's a digital format and in content for aggregation purposes, parsing and abstracting services, it's worth taking stock of all the various places that content is going, and then check with each of those recipients of your content and find out exactly what they are doing with it. It's possible you could find out that your journal is being archived. For example, Ellen Press works closely with Bio1. A lot of our journals are in the Bio1 collection. Bio1, in turn, sends all of its content to Koninklijke, and it also pays the fee for this service. So any journal that's in Bio1 is being archived long-term. If you're sending your journal content out for aggregation, it might be going to a reliable long-term archive. Take a strategic view of your journal and your goals. You want to look at all the different options and consider that there's not just one way to do this. For example, if you have a year of content and you really want to get it digitized and put online, such as the Biodiversity Heritage Library might make sense. But you have to keep in mind that services like that will put them online open access. So it's important that you're able to enjoy revenue from your content. You might want another solution. If you do that, you may also have to be prepared to pay for the scanning and the hosting and the continued accessibility. So that's the bulk of the presentation, and I want to remind you that we will be posting a slide with links to all of these various initiatives, as well as a white paper that I wrote with a colleague here at Allen Press, where you can find more information about journal archiving. And so I turn this presentation back over to Joanna, who will be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Peter. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so do go ahead and chat those in, and I will relay the questions to Peter as they come in. The first one we have is, what file formats do most of these archives use? Are they using PDF, XML?
Yeah, mostly XML, and what they're doing in some cases, for Portico, I think the emphasis is less on the format than on the metadata that's contained in the file. And when you look at what Portico is doing, it is observing publisher's original metadata so that it has all the original information. It's also adding its own metadata so that it's preserved in a format that it can maintain and always make accessible. And I have to confess here, I'm not a tech, and when I hear these kinds of things, I'm satisfied with the answer in the sense that I'm satisfied that the person giving me the answer understands what that means. But frankly, I have some of the same questions. How do we know that that particular file format is actually going to be accessible in 100 years? And I think that gets at the root of what a lot of people are thinking about journal archiving. How do we know? And I think ultimately the fact is that we don't know, but we're using the best information that we have currently and the best technology has to offer to ensure that the information is preserved in a way that it will be accessible. Going to happen in 100 years ago, well, I can't tell you what's going to happen in 10 years. I couldn't have foreseen the iPad, for example. I think things are going to keep changing, and we have to ensure that the information is readable at some level and trust that there are smart people working on this.
Great. Our next question, do data archives like GenBank, Treebase, or Dryad fall under any of these digital categories? And are they as widely used for long-term data archiving?
The short answer to that is I simply don't know. What I understand about GenBank, for example, is that this is a repository for data, not necessarily a repository for final published versions of articles. I have to admit I haven't used GenBank. I am familiar with some of the journals that do deposit information in GenBank, but I would check with those particular organizations and find out what they are able to provide storage.
Yeah, and I think the same is true for Dryad, is that it's mainly geared towards data sets, not article content.
Which is important, and I think in some ways becoming more important. I understand that there is a more interest in preserving data itself, because then other scientists will be able to go back and perhaps do more than the original author was able to do with the data. But I understand there is also concern about ownership of data. So I'd definitely be interested to know what these initiatives are able to do in terms of storage and accessibility. But in terms of preserving the scholarly record, I don't think their purpose is.
Okay, the next question, do most people using locks give current subscribers access to the entire back file of content, or do they only allow archiving of locks from the point of a subscription going forward?
Well, I think I'm actually in notes here. I think it is possible for the information to continue to be accessible for the duration of the time that the library had access to it. That answers the question. Each participating library in locks can preserve content that's authorized to preserve. So conceivably, some libraries that participate in locks would have access to some content and others would not. What I'm not certain about is whether a library that had access, say, from 2000 to 2005 would then continue to have access to that material indefinitely. So I hope that at least partly answers the question.
Okay, one more question, Peter. Can you talk about cross-ref, how that might factor in? Is cross-ref an archive?
Cross-ref is really not exactly an archive. Cross-ref doesn't do anything with content itself, at least in terms of storing it. Cross-ref registers DOIs, and it's a mechanism for tracking the links from one type of content to another. But no, in terms of storing a permanent record of the articles themselves, that's not what Cross-ref does.
Okay. What obligations do you feel publishers have to individual subscribers versus institutional subscribers for material they receive digitally while members, so like after their subscription has lapsed?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the short answer is it depends on the publisher and the nature of the agreement. But I think that the agreement should be explicit about what the individual subscriber does get access to, and if it states that the subscriber should have access to any amount of material for an indefinite period of time, then certainly the publisher needs to maintain that. But I think everyone should take a close look at the agreements and find out exactly what the obligation is.
I have one more question. You talked about an embargo a couple of times in the presentation. Can you tell us more about what an embargo is?
Absolutely. I talked about that, I believe, in the context of PubMed Central. PubMed Central has a mandate to post accepted articles, and this is a stipulation by the National Institutes of Health. When that information is NIH funded, that it has to be made open to the public, but it does not have to be made open to the public immediately upon acceptance. So an embargo is the period of time between when the article is accepted and when it will be posted. The embargo is negotiable. It's typically 6 to 12 months. And the reason for this is to allow the copyright holder to have time to enjoy the revenue from the content. So the publisher has 6 months to a year to put the information in the publisher's journal and gain subscription revenue from that. And then after a year, it will be posted on PubMed Central in its accepted form. So the embargo is simply that period of time. The same thing with sometimes a press release. If we do a press release on an article and we send it to the media as part of a marketing effort, if the press release is ready before the information has been published, we instruct the media to respect an embargo period of a few days or a week or however long it takes for the publication to actually be made public.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions from our participants, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I want to thank Peter for being with us today and sharing information about archiving services. And I also want to thank those of you who attended the webinar today. I hope the overview of different initiatives has proven helpful and will continue to give you more information to help you preserve your content for future generations. We're sending out a brief survey that will include links to both the slides and a video recording of today's session. Peter mentioned that there was a resources site, and that will also be included in the links, the slides that are posted online. So do take a few moments to complete the survey. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve future webinars and suggestions for future topics. And don't forget, you can continue the conversation on Facebook. So that concludes our session for today. Thanks very much for joining us.